The drama begins on a crisp American morning. Citizens begin their day as usual, going about their normal rituals with energy and drive. On this beautiful American day, so full of promise, no one thinks to look to the skies for the coming attack.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
When it arrives on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the attack is shocking in its violence and appalling in its destructiveness. Nearly 3,000 Americans lose their lives at the hands of a surprise attack from a dangerous foe. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt describes the nation's fierce emotions.
I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
I think we have a serious situation going on at the World Trade Center. Unconfirmed reports are saying that a plane just flew into the South Tower. Standing here...
Many thought that the tragedy of December 7th would never be repeated. Yet nearly 60 years later, another drama begins with a similar tragedy on another crisp American morning. This time, on September 11th, 2001, the attack from the sky is just as shocking and just as appalling. And again, the president is resolute.
Tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Our grief is turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
Soon, American soldiers were fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some say that as GIs died in these faraway lands, Americans did their part back home. Old Glory made a roaring comeback. Proud to be American signs littered front yards, windows, and storefronts. And it wasn't long before the country found itself swimming in yellow ribbons. On bumpers, in trees, hanging from light posts, pinned on lapels. Here was a home front determined not to forget its soldiers and loved ones. But there is a small group of Americans who remember that earlier home front. They wonder if today's citizens are truly doing everything possible on the new home front. How much are we really sacrificing for our country in its time of need? How willing are we to give up our time, our food, our sweat, our blood, to ensure that the country stays united? They remember their own level of sacrifice, back to the 1940s in the American Heartland, and their eyes light up in memory. Could Americans learn to sacrifice like they once did? Most crucially, are we failing our country in its time of need? Or are we scrappers? After Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt faced a series of problems.
The United States was not very well prepared once war came with Pearl Harbor. And so when December 1941 comes, the United States still is well behind where it should have been, where it could have been in preparation for the conflict.
1 month after the attack, Roosevelt challenged the home front, demanding that the nation begin near impossible levels of military production.
We shall produce 60,000 planes, 10,000 10,000, by the way, more than the goal that we set a year and a half ago. This includes 45,000 combat planes, bombers, dive bombers, pursuit planes.
Roosevelt also ordered up thousands of tanks and anti-aircraft guns, all to be made in just 1 year.
These were staggering numbers, and many people in Congress were just shocked and thought, this is not possible. We couldn't possibly do this.
When Roosevelt said that he wanted to create thousands of planes and thousands of ships and so on early in 1942, a lot of people thought that that was way out of reach of any economic system.
Roosevelt's ambitious goals relied on a highly motivated home front. Unfortunately, the spirited surge that followed Pearl Harbor didn't last very long. History books don't talk about this very much, but only 6 months after America's entry into the conflict, war bond sales were declining. Public morale was down, and 1/3 of the country's citizens told pollsters that they didn't know what the U.S. was fighting for.
Part of the mythology of World War II is that everybody willingly and quickly left their families, left their careers, left their homes to go off to war. And that wasn't the case. These Americans had been, listening to the news for so many years. They knew this was very bad, but I think some of them wondered, well, it's so far away. Americans are still getting over the trauma of World War I. There were many people who believe that the United States never should have gotten involved in World War I. So to get involved in another war that could be seen as a European war is not something that Americans are very excited about.
Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
If war breaks out in Europe, I think that this country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglements.
I haven't the slightest idea of European affairs.
In the event of war in Europe, I think we should stay out of it entirely.
And all our efforts should be made to keep out of the fight.
Let Europe fight their own battles. They mean nothing to us.
To make matters worse, the steel industry was in crisis.
The steel plants were running out of steel, and they were going to have to shut down, and it was going to hurt the war effort because they needed steel for tanks and guns and bombs and everything else.
Creating the tens of thousands of ships, tanks, and planes that the president wanted would require arms factories to operate night and day. But just months after Pearl Harbor, some steel plants were actually shutting down. The problem? There was a nationwide lack of scrap metal necessary for the rapid construction of munitions.
Early in the war, there was a lack of scrap. We're talking 1942, very early in the war for the U.S., because it's junk. And people don't realize that they need to donate their junk to the war effort.
In the making of steel, the use of scrap was exceedingly important. And it was mixed with iron ore. So the more scrap you had, the better it was.
Why is scrap so vital to the defense program? Because steel is the very backbone of production. And steel is made from 50% scrap and 50% raw material. Every ton of scrap used in the production of new steel conserves 2 tons of iron ore, 1 ton of coal, nearly half a ton of limestone, and many other natural resources.
Unfortunately, although the government tried to convince Americans to turn in all the scrap metal they could find, initial scrap recovery efforts were virtual disasters.
There was, at least at the outset of the war effort, a shortage of available scrap metal that's used in steel production, and so there was a kind of an immediate awareness.
Steel mills were running out of material. There were various government agencies involved in promoting the idea of the public turning in scrap metal. But I don't believe that the government entities had any effect at the grassroots level.
What made the situation especially frustrating was that the scrap was right there, in Americans' basements, farm lots, factories, and so on. The crisis became so serious that Donald Nelson, head of the War Production Board, told reporters that the lack of scrap coming into the nation's foundries meant that before long, American soldiers would begin to pay for the deficit with their lives.
We must have a smashing superiority and keep it that way to the end. So I give you this solemn thought. The cost of keeping our freedom will be measured not in money, not in time, not in production, but in American lives. Keep this thought burning in your minds and hearts. The countless lives and untold suffering will be saved if extra effort at home brings victory just 1 month closer.
It was quite an emotional thing. You know, everybody was dropping their stuff and entering this because we were at war. And we weren't ready.
We are a nation at war, a new kind of war, total war.
In a very real sense, the fortunes of the war hung on this moment. Not enough scrap meant not enough munitions coming out of the factories. And without munitions, the war effort was lost.
Here we are fighting two wars, so to speak, over two vastly different areas of the globe, and I think we didn't realize how much munitions we were going to use and how badly we needed them. So I think it was quite critical that we get as much stuff together as we could.
By the summer of 1942, the scrap situation was proving to be a dangerous thorn in the side of the government's war effort. Yet help would soon be on the way, from a most unexpected source. With the administration's pleas for scrap failing miserably, the time was right for a new, localized movement to emerge. In an era of total warfare, the term home front is no accident. Just as the war can be won or lost on the battlefront, so too can it be won or lost on the home front. In 1942, Omaha, Nebraska was over 5,000 miles away from the ongoing battle in the Pacific. Yet here, on the great American prairie, another vital effort was about to take place.
It's been said that there was something about the people of Nebraska, their pioneer spirit, the fact that the frontier wasn't that far in their past. Nebraskans also are descended from pioneers who came out here searching for opportunity. And opportunity is something that really characterizes the state, that search, that looking for. We want to find things, we want to get things done.
You know, people talk about pioneers as being these rugged individuals, but the pioneers who survived and succeeded worked together, and there's a certain kind of teamwork on the frontier that was required, I think, in order for people to survive, and a lot of people who settled in Nebraska came with nothing and just scratched a living out of the dirt.
As the largest city in Nebraska, Omaha was a natural focus of this rugged pioneer spirit. By the 1940s, Omaha was still less than 100 years old.
In 1942, Omaha was still something of a rough-hewn frontier town. There was a lot of vice in Omaha, prostitution, gambling, lots and lots of alcohol in Omaha during Prohibition. But Omaha was growing larger. It was getting a sense of gentility.
In the summer of 1942, with its massive stockyards and its history as a railroad hub, the growing prairie city was a cash-rich cowtown capital, and, in the view of one Henry Dorley, the perfect place to win a scrap.
Henry Dorley was an amazing character. He was born in Barbados, in the British West Indies. He immigrated to this country seeking opportunity, came out to Omaha, went to work for the Union Pacific Railroad, and was a laborer, met the daughter of the publisher of the World Herald, and subsequently married her, and then began a career with the World Herald.
Dorley became very, very familiar with the details of newspapers business, ultimately becoming publisher of the paper.
One day in early July 1942, Dorley read his newspaper's gloomy stories about the national scrap emergency. Frustrated with the country's failure to gather scrap for the war effort, he asked his wife, Margaret Hitchcock Dorley, what she thought. Her response was both simple and powerful. Henry, what have you done to solve the scrap problem?
I can imagine her tone was something like, well, Henry, what have you done about the scrap metal drive? A woman who certainly knows that her husband wields a great deal of influence and power in the state. So she was challenging him to do his part.
He accepted her challenge, but she also presented it in a, how can I say, very appropriate manner. Not with any condemnation or insult or scoffing. She said, what have you done to it?
But what could Dorley do about the nationwide scrap shortage? He knew that he had little influence in Washington. He'd often used the paper to criticize Roosevelt's New Deal. But he agreed with his wife that the largest newspaper in Nebraska ought to be able to do something within the state. And given the state's pioneering mentality, he figured that if Nebraskans became energized to gather scrap, they could easily set an example for the nation.
Dorley was probably, I think he had a strong civic sense himself, and also as the publisher of the paper and longtime resident here, I think he knew how the people were wired. You know, he knew what motivated people in Nebraska. Dorley knew exactly what he was doing.
Dorley was well aware that the Roosevelt administration had been trying to gather scrap for over 6 months, with little success.
The Roosevelt administration's first efforts to gather scrap were at best disappointing. Those efforts don't produce the sort of scouring of the landscape to produce all the sort of scrap that might have been out there and available.
Paul Cabot, a deputy director in the Federal War Production Board, said that despite a large number of scrap volunteers, the government just didn't have the leadership to fix the problem.
We have not produced enough scrap. These volunteer workers, some 125,000 of them, need stimulation and leadership. If the public is properly aroused, there will be no city, town, or hamlet in this country that can afford not to have an active, hard-working salvage committee.
The major problem, as Dorley saw it, seemed to be that the government's scrap efforts were hampered by too much bureaucracy, a problem which did little to energize the public about scrap collections. But Dorley intuitively seemed to know that it was local and community energy that was the key.
And what was needed was a scrap drive that could rally people at what I've called the grassroots level. And that meant that you needed to take the development of enthusiasm right down to the community level.
The Saturday Evening Post later commented that what Dorley was looking for was a drive that was not burdened by coordinators who had to devote time to coordinating coordinators who were coordinating other coordinators. Yet the problem with such a grassroots approach was in motivating the citizens themselves. Dorley's solution? Turn the project into an enormous contest, complete with publicity and prizes.
First of all, he made it competitive so that each county could compete against each other. And Nebraska has an unusually large number of counties, or 93 counties. Secondly, he made it something that everyone could have an equal chance at winning.
In 1 week's time, he had announced it. He not only had thought of the plan, put it into motion, gotten the organization going, and of course, given orders to his staff at the World Herald.
Working swiftly, Dorley and his publishing team put together their plan. In only 1 week, they were ready to go public. On July 11th, 1942, the publisher took to the airwaves, outlining the scrap emergency to Nebraskans in a statewide radio address.
Throughout America, arms factories are slowing down or shutting down because they can't get the material to make guns, tanks, airplanes, and ships. Why can't they get the materials? Because the farms and attics and basements and backyards in this country have millions of tons of scrap metal, but the average American hasn't bothered to turn it in to the government.
Dorley challenged his listeners to show the rest of the country how to gather scrap. For 3 weeks, he said, Nebraskans would become scrappers, putting their lives on hold to scour the state for much-needed metal, all in a race to see who could gather the most scrap.
In this contest, county will be pitted against county on a per capita basis, firm against firm, individual against individual, and junior groups against junior groups. And the World Herald will pay $2,000 in war bonds to the winners.
Dorley's message was a direct challenge to the citizens of Nebraska. Which of the state's 93 counties, he asked, would collect the most per capita scrap during the contest? Which communities would show their patriotism by creating gigantic piles of scrap metal on the town square? Which individuals would organize their cities, towns, or villages in order to show the rest of the nation how to collect scrap, and thereby restart the nation's steel factories?
Nebraskans are intensely competitive. If you know anything about the Nebraska football team, you know that Nebraskans love to win. And so the competitive nature of the scrap drive was extremely important.
It was quite an effort. It was an all-out effort. Every merchant, everybody got into the act.
Doorley's idea had an immediate impact, as the listening audience began to respond even before the drive officially began.
Within minutes of when Henry Doorley had his initial radio broadcast, the World Herald was getting calls from people. One woman said that she knew where there were a bunch of abandoned railroad rails that somebody could come and collect. I wouldn't have wanted to even been a laborer sitting down eating lunch and taking your eye off your lunch bucket, because some kid probably would have grabbed it and put it in the scrap pile. Nothing was safe if it was made of metal, I'm sure.
A few days later, the drive kicked off with great fanfare at a major rally. Several thousand citizens showed up, each carrying the price of admission, at least 5 pounds of scrap metal.
Union Pacific sponsored a rally, and a few thousand people came out, and it was a big deal. Union Pacific got a fair amount of publicity.
Omaha was the headquarters for Union Pacific. They're also an organization that was spread all across the state of Nebraska so they could draw on all of their employees. And Union Pacific threw itself just lock, stock, and barrel into this.
The Union Pacific in 1942 was led by William Bull Jeffers, who was an intimidating figure in Omaha, as friendly as a stray bulldog, as he put it. When he told his employees that the railroad would be a leader in the drive, they listened.
Jeffers was a very dynamic executive. He had worked his way up through the ranks of the Union Pacific Railroad, and he was a no-nonsense administrator. He was what one would call a railroader's railroader. He was blunt. He was plain-spoken. He was interested in results and getting results as quickly as possible, and he would not take no for an answer.
The Union Pacific's rally made the state's other major railroad, the Burlington, take notice. The next day, a Burlington executive stormed into the World Herald office of J.M. Harding, Henry Doorling's assistant and the manager of the upcoming drive.
My grandfather wrote that the next day people from Burlington show up in his office and say, "Hey, we're going to do scrap drive. We can do it as well as Union Pacific can. We're ready to go. Here we are. Tell us what to do." And so they started sponsoring things as well. And so I think they had a competition going that was mirrored throughout the state and in other industries.
J.M. Harding himself later recalled how the patriotism of both railroads made a difference.
The first thing that the Union Pacific did was to put 20 people full-time on this job, with instructions to do nothing until the end of the drive but keep the scrap moving in and keep after the people in their towns. I don't know how many they had at the end, but there are a lot more than 20. The Burlington went out and did the same thing.
The railroads and their rallies had helped prompt people across the state to show their competitive spirit. Dozens of local newspapers decided to pitch in too.
The World Herald picked a very wise plan to try and bring the rest of Nebraska into the scrap drive. I think that they thought that we can get other newspapers, other radio stations, other communities involved.
Now, Doorley, as a practical man, recognized that he had to get his message to the newspapers across the state because of their influence at the community and regional level within the state. Now, he also recognized that the editors and publishers of these papers needed to know that this was not a promotional gimmick that would redound to the financial benefit of the World Heralds. And so with this point established, he could better expect the cooperation of newspaper publishers across the state.
Rural areas of the state were indeed just as enthusiastic about the contest as their city cousins. The World Herald reported that it was jingle, jangle, jingle all over the state, as Nebraskans tossed their spurs and practically everything else onto salvage contest scrap heaps that were growing by the ton. Meanwhile, within the World Herald building, the staff was giving the scrap effort its full attention. Lawrence Youngman was a seasoned World Herald reporter who was covering the scrap drive full-time.
At the World Herald, I was handling one of the most important assignments, perhaps the most important that I've ever had. Henry Dorley has launched a statewide scrap salvage campaign in which we hope to set a record for the whole nation to shoot at. I've never seen so much pressure put behind anything in this state before.
Soon, the newspaper staffers found themselves printing even more about the contest than they'd imagined. The competition was featured in as many as 10 stories in every issue, and reporters also filed countless scrap-related pictures, features, human interest stories, and editorials. J.M. Harding recalled the personal stake the World Herald staffers had in the drive.
Before this thing was over, I had fellows coming to my office and weeping about it. Not the women, but the men. It stirred them so deeply, it got clear down to the bottom of their shoes. That's what it did to everyone that stayed over.
The World Herald paid its staffers to create 6 full-page ads on behalf of the scrap drive. In the colorful appeals, a demonic Hitler glared defiantly at readers. A youthful farm family displayed a cheerful enthusiasm for the contest, subtly reminding readers of America's earliest patriots. And cartoon-drawn Nebraskans of every stripe pelted the Axis leaders with scrap.
It was all focused toward the 3 who were already embroiled in a heap of things. There's everything symbolic about what we grew up with. You can see all of the things that were near and dear to their lives. You could relate to this. You could find yourself, your family, or someone you knew in that cartoon within a second.
And to see housewives and farmers and children picking up all kinds of objects, pots and pans, and hurling them at these 3 villains who were buried in scrap. It was of course funny, so it's going to attract your attention, but it made folks, I would think, folks in Nebraska seem like they could do something. They could do, and the 3 characters look quite battered. You know, they've been pummeled by the people of Nebraska.
Another advertisement that grabbed readers' attention featured a daring picture of Mrs. J.J. Stewart, an Omaha homemaker and scrapper.
The imagery of a woman in Omaha holding a automobile muffler, as you might hold a M1 or a Grand Rifle or something of that kind, was effective because it showed everybody that we're all in this. Women are in it, men are in it, little kids are in it, but here is what women on the home front are doing to support our boys overseas.
This image of this woman in 1942 holding a piece of scrap like a rifle speaks volumes to women across the country. And women can look at this and say, wow, here's a domestic woman. She's wearing a dress. She's standing on a truck. There's a bed springs behind her head. I mean, she represents home. This is a pioneer. This is a warrior of scrap. This is a woman who's actually pictured in a position of strength. And other women would look at that and say, well, that's easy, I can do that, and look how significant I will be.
Yet the aspect of the scrap coverage that captured the most attention in Nebraska was the county versus county battle, which was reflected in published daily standings, much like baseball standings on the sports page. Life magazine, marveling at the power of the county standings, later wrote that they attracted so much attention from Nebraska readers that the race took on all the enthusiasm of a college football championship.
For those 3 weeks during the scrap drive, they moved the sports page onto the front page. You know, every day counties were telegraphing in the results of their drive the previous day, and every day there were new standings, you know, based on which county had gathered the most scrap per capita.
If you publish the standings, it gives even the little towns the opportunity to say, we can win this thing. Let's get out there and really see what we can have. Joe doesn't need that old combine. Let's bring it in. So I think it was a very slick move on their part.
Soon, in towns across the state, countless scrap piles began to grow. In Omaha, the so-called Scrap Mountain went over 300 tons on the third full day of collections.
They pretty much designated an entire city block in downtown Omaha where they would pile all the scrap that they collected, and I don't think they had any idea how big this thing was going to be, because I think by day 3 there were 600,000 pounds of scrap metal there, and as the days and weeks went on in this scrap drive, they kept moving the fences back, until finally I think they just abandoned the fences and designated the entire block as the location, as Scrap Mountain, and it sort of became a tourist attraction.
What we see is a city block that had a mountain of old metal on it. This, of course, was a symbol. Make that mountain higher, promote the size of this scrap heap, expand the fences outward, and this scrap heap in downtown Omaha became a visual standard, at least for the people of Omaha, in terms of how the drive was going.
The quick growth of the Omaha Scrap Mountain was due in part to an efficient collection system. Area businesses donated trucks for the drive, and volunteers would take them at scheduled intervals to designated neighborhoods. Citizens would leave scrap on their front lawns for pickup, while workers would help load the trucks for the trip downtown.
A truck came to our house and picked up the scrap, and because we had piled all this huge amount of scrap on the front lawn, and it occurred to us that somebody was going to have to pick this up, and they did. They came around, and volunteers picked it up, put it in a truck, and took it downtown.
Elsewhere in Nebraska, countless other scrap piles were growing too.
I don't remember if one of the papers said how long the pile was and how high, but I remember maybe being 50, 60 to 100 yards long and very, very high. How they got it up that high, I don't know.
I suppose the scrap pile was 7 or 8 feet tall and maybe 20 feet in diameter. It was a huge pile of scrap.
It wasn't long before all that scrap material began to add up. Statewide, after only 1 week of competition, Nebraskans found that they had turned in over 8.5 million pounds of scrap material. Of course, as in any hard-fought competition, it wasn't long before the competitive spirit turned into the occasional controversy.
There were counties that had sort of historic rivalries that had a lot of fun with that, trying to beat each other.
One particularly fierce rivalry took place not far north of Omaha, along the Missouri River. Here, Washington County had predicted it would win the contest, but quickly fell behind its neighbor Burt County, and the local newspaper let readers know about it.
The newspaper in Blair made a very strong point to its readers that neighboring Burt County to the north was on a per capita basis apparently running far ahead of Washington County, and so the Blair Pilot Tribune encouraged the people of Washington County to get a move on and turn that scrap in, and let's not have our county embarrassed in this way.
The newspaper felt that Burt County had shamed Washington County in the early going by finding nearly 12 pounds of scrap per person, compared to Washington's 5 ounces. The newspaper shamed those who just couldn't find a way. "Too busy, are you, pal?" asked the newspaper. "Too hard a job, is it? Something more important first, eh?" Pleasant dreams, then.
There was so much community pressure because you're demonstrating your patriotism by placing your scrap in a pile in front of your house. If you see your neighbors doing that, I bet you feel that you need to contribute as well.
It was a very sensible and very intelligent choice to get people competing against each other, to draw on the community pride that existed in Nebraska. People in small towns were proud of their towns. If Gothenburg had the opportunity to beat Lexington or beat Cozad, boy, they were going to do it if they possibly could. The rivalries between those towns were very strong. And so the idea of a contest that pitted one community against another seems to me to be a very, very smart way to do it.
In at least one case, people from a town did in fact find a way to appropriate scrap from a nearby rival.
We heard about it on WJAG that the residents in Battle Creek would have put all their scrap in front of their home, and on Saturday morning about 10 o'clock, somebody would come by and pick it up. So we took advantage of that information, and we took our pickup over to Battle Creek and went up and down and picked up all the pieces of scrap, tossed it in the pickup, and then we raced back to Norfolk.
Almost anything was fair game because this was for the war effort, and this was going to make a difference. And we were told that, and we believed that.
The fierce competition between neighboring towns and counties was a sign that the World Herald's contest had captured the state's attention. Yet contest organizers were not satisfied. Dorley's original goal had been for every Nebraskan to turn in at least 100 pounds of scrap material in 3 weeks. But amazingly, after 1 week of the contest, the statewide average in the competition was still less than 7 pounds per person. Clearly, there was much more work to do.
I'm sure that if we were to look at the details, each county that we would find this message coming across loud and clear. Look, folks, we need to redouble our effort. So what you have here, I think, is probably what we would call a halftime pep talk from the coach.
The state's newspaper editors were quick to point out to Nebraskans that the pace of collections needed to pick up, or the drive would be a high-profile failure.
Adams County was not doing very well, and we felt badly, and we went out and tried to find other stuff. I don't know that we were stealing other kids' bikes or stuff like that, but we felt that we were not doing our part.
Unless the scrap supply improves materially and immediately, we may be forced to review our entire program of steel expansion for defense.
With general agreement that more people needed to get involved in the scrap, the World Herald's drive began to accelerate. Drive officials asked for volunteer pilots to fly across the state's farms and ranches, spotting abandoned piles of scrap and dropping leaflets pleading for scrap collection participation. Dozens of scrapping sports events were held. To be on a team, players had to provide scrap. To watch the game, spectators had to bring scrap too. The scrappers became more and more inventive in their search. A mortician in Ogallala contributed a 1913 hearse to the Keith County Scrap Drive, while women in McCook were advised to donate any metal in their corsets. Impromptu scrap organizations appeared, such as the Scrappy Weppies in Cumming County and the Super Duper Scrap Snoopers in Phelps County. Local movie theaters began to join the fray. Every theater in the state held at least one scrap matinee, in which the price of admission was a certain amount of scrap for the drive.
My parents had a free movie that people who had donated scrap got to go to the movie free. And of course that was big in those days and brought in quite a bit of scrap.
In some families, collecting scrap metal and being able to send your children off to a free movie may have made those kids happy and save the parents a little bit of money.
The World Herald's J.M. Harding remembered the impact of the scrap matinees well.
When we told the Omaha kids that all the theaters in town would give a free movie on Saturday morning and that the admission would be 5 pounds or more of scrap, 12,000 kids laid 150,000 pounds of scrap in front of the theaters, blocking the streets.
Drive organizers devised another successful strategy, personally asking business owners to tour their facilities with scrap officials present to ensure that all available industrial scrap had been offered. Such tours invariably resulted in more scrap on the pile. In a similar tour, Burlington Railroad executives in a single afternoon found 90 tons of metal for the steel mills. Even the World Herald found plenty of in-house scrap. Over 9 tons of old press machines were found, having been rusting away since before World War I. And on the roof, scrappers found dozens of cast iron torches ornamenting the building's facade. Before long, workers were removing them for the drive. Such strategies were vital to the acceleration of the campaign. Even Nebraska Governor Dwight Griswold decided to push citizens further, signing an official scrap proclamation with much fanfare.
Fine as our effort has been, the results must be greater if this campaign is to succeed. Therefore I, Dwight Griswold, Governor of Nebraska, hereby proclaim a statewide scrap holiday.
In response to the governor's proclamation, The drive reached another level of effort. Farm scrap was gathered by the ton and transported to railroad sidings. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Campfire Girls, and Red Cross volunteers blanketed the state's homes, knocking on doors, cleaning out basements and attics, and loading and unloading trucks. In the town of West Point, Mr. and Mrs. Emil Wilde celebrated their 22nd anniversary with a scrap dance, with the price of admission 20 or more pounds of scrap. And across the state, townsfolk drove into the countryside, helping farmers and ranchers to find and gather the tons of scrap readily available in rural areas. Yet if the accelerated contest captured the attention of the adults, drive organizers were careful to reach out to school-age children too, making them into junior scrap commandos.
Every citizen must help program our, God bless them, the kids. Banding together in one gigantic army of youth, they rise to their country's call for help. One of their primary duties is to keep their city clean. And in this process of cleaning up is incorporated the collection of salvage. In this salvage business, the children set the example for their elders. Where they dig it up, nobody knows.
Usually I would go with my brother, and if it was more than we could carry, we would enlist our friends to help, and we physically carried it. The scrap pile was up on the hill at the high school, and of course we had to climb the hill to get there.
She had a neighbor that had this old stove in their basement. It was probably about 2 foot square and regular height. And she and I carried that out of that basement, and then we had to carry it, I would think, probably at the most 3 blocks to get it across the street to or across the highway to this scrap drive. And we would carry it about an inch at a time because it was so heavy, and we were just little girls yet.
Although the potential for injury to such young scrappers was ever present, few junior commandos took the time to worry about their personal safety.
To my knowledge, nobody got hurt. They should have got killed, but they didn't get hurt.
Farm kid, you didn't worry about them things. If you cut your finger, you went and got a piece of sliver off a bar of soap and put a rag around it, preferably white, but red worked too.
We were infallible. As kids are, even today, they never thought of getting hurt. We'd get in there and get a hold of that old machinery and pull it out of the trees and out of the weeds, and never thought of getting hurt at all.
The scrapping children were not only fearless, but selfless as well. 6-year-old Dick Kleiber of Hastings was typical of many young scrappers, not only going door to door for scrap, but donating his own possessions to the drive.
I don't remember making the decision, but I can remember feeling satisfied that I had done something, and then feeling that I don't have wheels anymore. And I remember just feeling a sense of loss when my tricycle was gone.
I had a collection of lead soldiers, had about 15 of them, and I one day just carried them up to school and tossed them into the pile.
We had a little radio flyer red wagon, and that thing, we nearly wore it out pulling it around town finding scrap. And people would call us. I've got this, can you pick it up? And we would.
Remember going up to one porch, there were some cooking pans. We picked them up, took them down, put them in the wagon, were just ready to go, and the lady came running out the door, an elderly woman, and she says, I got more, and she was bringing pots and pans.
By enlisting children, the planners for the scrap drive had a way of contacting every household, every neighborhood, almost every adult. And after all, who could refuse an 8 or 10-year-old neighbor coming around with a little red wagon asking for contributions of unused metals for the war effort? That was a way in which I think the salvage drive got into people's hearts.
Junkie!
ain't junk no more, 'cause junk can win the war. What's junk to you has a job to do, 'cause junk ain't junk no more. Pipes and screens, worn-out machines, the kettle that doesn't pour. Collect today for the USA, 'cause junk can win the war. From the attic to the cellar, start looking if you please. All your trash will go to smash the tricky Japanese. Old automobiles, old iron wheels, and the plow that works no more. Take a tip from Uncle, junk will win the war.
I think sometimes this was like a children's crusade. They would gather up the tin cans and they'd take the lids off the tin cans and then they'd stomp them with their foot to make them flat. And they always said, it's just like stomping Hitler in the head when you stomp that tin can. And it's a perfect thing for children to do. It has the features of a treasure hunt, and yet very, very serious about it.
And we'd look in the backyards of houses that we'd go by and see if there was anything there that we could pick up.
Friday, I went to Betty's house at 11 o'clock and took 60 pounds of scrap metal to the scrap salvage and gave it to the workers. I played with Betty in the afternoon.
My cousin somehow got a large magnet tied on a string, and we kids went up and down the alleys collecting whatever would stick to that magnet.
But older school kids were involved in the drive too, particularly those who had access to vehicles. Bill Nicholas was a high school junior who went scrapping with fellow members of the local football team.
We went out northwest of town a few miles, found a deserted farmhouse, and noticed it had a windmill. So we pulled up the dump truck we had. We had saws and hammers and wrenches and pillar plows, and we were going to take it down piece by piece. And as we were beginning to ascend it, a farmer drove up to his windmill, and he needed it for water for his crops. He understood what we were doing, so he never got angry at us. He just told us, leave it alone and get out of sight.
Among the football players gathering scrap with Bill Nicholas was a young would-be magician named Johnny Carson. The senior at Norfolk High School was just as avid in finding scrap as his teammates.
One of the things I remember was during the war, when we would have all the drives. They had the scrap drives, they had the rubber drives, and so forth. And we went out. Yeah, and they would have contests between the classes, and we were seniors, I guess, at that time.
Yeah.
And we went out. I remember us getting a truck from somebody.
Somebody in the class worked after school for Ballantyne Furniture Company.
Yeah.
And old man Ballantyne, God, he must have been 85 years old, had this old delivery truck that was stored in his garage.
A panel side truck, right?
Told us we could use it.
We took that truck. It didn't run too well.
Oh.
We drove that thing around, and the idea was to bring in metal. And the more metal in it, we went to, I guess, Robinson's, and then would weigh the metal on the truck to see who was ahead. We literally took everything that was not nailed down. We dug up old autos. We stole appropriated fence to throw on here.
Yeah.
But whatever.
Remember, some of the farmers showed up here the next morning looking for some plows.
A hay rack or something. We took a hay rack. But the Ballantyne, I remember Mr. Ballantyne never got the truck back.
Never found out what happened?
We never found out what happened to the truck. I don't know whether we dismantled it. We dismantled it?
Probably.
I have a feeling we dismantled old man Ballantyne's truck. True, and
the last load we just drove out.
He was one of the energetic boys, and as I recall, he got his hands dirty just like everyone else and was willing to participate.
High school students in Omaha were doing their bit as well. In one infamous episode, Central High students forcefully removed Elmwood Park's 315-pound bronze sculpture of a baseball player known as Bosco and sent it to the scrap heap downtown. Senior Bill Kaiser was one of the daring students.
We had to get a truck and wrenches and crowbars, and we went out to the park and got up on top of the pedestal and discovered that that baby was in there pretty good. It was bolted down and it probably rusted. And so we worked hard at getting it down. Eventually we got it wobbling, and eventually Bosco came down. Bosco ended up on the scrap heap, and somebody had gotten the bat out of his hands, and in his place they put a rifle. And on his head they got the baseball cap, and they put some kind of a armored headpiece on top of Bosco. So I guess Bosco went to war.
It was more than things that weren't wanted. There were people who gave away things that were really valuable just because of the drive.
The people just, even thinking, if they remembered that there was something buried, well, they would make every effort to get it. They just became involved, and that was the best they could do during the war.
Into metal, cannons that roar, guns, tanks, battleships. That's the plow that worked no more. Your junk has wings. America sings liberty forevermore.
Throw your scrap into the fight. Junk can win the war.
And so, patriotic Nebraskans, both young and old, found themselves going to extraordinary lengths to find their treasures. They knocked down city water tanks, they recovered buried railroad tracks, they dug out abandoned bridges, and they descended on abandoned factories, salvaging industrial scrap by the ton. Not surprisingly, the variety of material in the state's scrap piles grew more and more astonishing. Omaha's scrap mountain swelled as its bulk began to sport cast iron bathtubs, baby carriages, boilers, and even 39 grand pianos. J.M. Harding recalled that many of the donated items had a personal feel.
A woman gave the shell casing that her husband brought back from Verdun. He died a year after he came home from the wounds he got over there. That's what she had to remember the last war by. And when she handed that to the truck driver and told him what it was, the truck driver bawled. That's what it did to them.
The Omaha World Herald included a story about a mother who comes running down the street following the truck that has just collected scrap metal in her neighborhood, and she found one more piece, and she gives it to the driver, and they throw it in the truck, and she says, "My son is leaving on Thursday for the war." This woman very likely felt like this is what she could do for her son. And I think that was true of a lot of citizens in Nebraska. 16 million men served in this war. Everybody knew somebody who was serving. By giving a little bit of scrap metal, it was something tangible that they could do to help maybe their son who was away, their neighbor's son, a cousin, someone they went to high school with. Everybody wanted to do something, to physically do something to help the war effort. And that's in my view, the magic of the scrap drive.
As the statewide drive neared its climax, the county standings turned into a veritable horse race. The Norfolk Daily News wrote, "Down the home stretch come Nebraska's 93 counties today in the scrap metal collection race." The lead changed almost daily as each county jockeyed for the big victory. In the end, it was a photo finish, with every citizen doing their best to put their team on top. At this point, they no longer cared about the prize money. They were in it for the competition. The last 2 days of the campaign, wrote editor and publisher magazine, found Nebraska working at fever pitch, with volunteer men and women scouring for scrap throughout the day and far into the night. But perhaps Henry Doorly put it best, looking back at the intensity of the competition's final days.
They just went wild, that's all. It was just like a prairie fire, and make no mistake about it.
With hundreds of piles all over the state, it took several days for contest officials to name the winners. But on August 26th, the World Herald announced that tiny Grant County, located in ranching country nearly 400 miles west of Omaha, was the overall winner. The county scrappers had gathered over 846,000 pounds, an incredible 637 pounds for every person in the county.
So Omaha may have collected, millions of pounds, but per capita, I don't think it was anywhere near the top of the heap. It was those small rural communities that took it upon themselves to make this their goal in life for those 3 weeks.
In fact, the top 6 counties in the standings, each averaging over 300 pounds per capita, were all in rural areas of the state. In Omaha, the much larger population totals hindered the competitiveness of the huge scrap mountain. Nevertheless, thousands of tons collected by Omahans in their mad dash to collect scrap could not be overlooked. In celebration of the achievement, the World Herald organized a gigantic bonfire and invited the community.
What more beautiful spot against the skyline than this bonfire? You know, at the completion of the drive, this was a joyous blaze.
As the World Herald reported, the blaze was a 75-foot pillar of fire that leaped into the sky in celebration of Omaha's first material victory on the home front in the present war. Too bad that it couldn't be seen in Berlin, concluded the newspaper, for it announced to the world that the Middle West is neither complacent nor asleep, that the people of this area will do whatever must be done to win the war. The newspaper was clearly pleased with the contest's amazing results. In a stirring tribute, the editorial staff wrote, "Oh, you people of Nebraska, you have been magnificent. In response to the appeal for scrap, you have, with complete unselfishness and a great deal of hard work, set a state per capita record of scrap turned in that establishes a standard for all the 47 other states. And what a standard." Dooley himself later related how pleased he was at the outcome.
On top of the 70,000 tons of scrap that we got for the government, there's another 100 pounds per person in Nebraska that we're going to get before the end of October. We'll get that because the people are now more war conscious than they've ever been before.
Yet Dooley was determined to set an example for other states to follow. The newspaper produced a booklet called the Nebraska Scrap Plan. The World Herald sent a copy to every major newspaper in the country, as well as to numerous government offices.
It was a report on what they had done. It was not a "you should" approach. It was not a glorified advertising campaign to get them to respond.
They were obviously pleased with the success of the drive. They thought people will be impressed with what we have done out here. But I think there was also probably a sense of patriotism that this is something that needs to be done, and we've already done it, so why reinvent the wheel?
The World Herald's booklet soon found its way into the hands of Donald Nelson, the administration's point person on the national scrap efforts, which had been failing so miserably. Nelson and his staff were frankly stunned by what Dooley had accomplished.
We were thoroughly impressed by what was done in Nebraska, by the able citizens of that state who pitched in and did a job which showed what could be done under good leadership.
So moved were Nelson and his staff that just 3 weeks after the end of the Nebraska campaign, the War Production Board invited the World Herald scrap team and over 100 other publishers from across the country to discuss taking what was becoming known as the Nebraska Plan national later that fall.
What happened at the meeting was that Henry Dooley and J.M. Harding explained how the drive was conceptualized and how it was carried out. And again, we get back to the idea of the practicality of the drive. How do you do this?
The publishers voted overwhelmingly to support the idea and immediately began making plans for a countrywide scrap drive. That national effort would begin just 4 weeks later.
The impact of the meeting in Washington, D.C. was that you have something that's already been a success in a state like Nebraska. They turn around, they go, they do it. You've got tons and tons of scrap metal that comes pouring in. This is a perfect case of positive consequences of a grassroots movement. It's very impressive.
The nation's newspaper publishers went back to their staffs early in September and put together one of the greatest campaigns in national history. They called it the Newspaper's Scrap Metal Drive. It would last 3 weeks, exactly like Dooley's Nebraska Plan.
I don't think that the World Herald thought it was going to be the leader as far as a national drive was concerned, but I think that the World Herald thought we had an extremely successful drive, and if we can get people across the country to follow the same template, to say that this is the way we want to do it, this is the way we should structure it, let's have a contest.
Steel industry experts estimated that the nation's mills needed to stockpile several million tons of scrap, since furnaces would operate all winter while snow and ice hampered scrap collection efforts. At the same time, American sailors and GIs were preparing for an all-out offensive on the battlefront, so the need for more munitions was tremendous. For these reasons, Donald Nelson was well aware that the nation was racing the clock as it planned the national effort.
Time is the greatest shortage of all. We must make every minute count.
As chairman of the War Production Board, I call upon every citizen of the United States to make this campaign a success. Let towering victory stockpiles in every community in the nation stand as symbols of America's defiance to the Axis.
Fortunately, the nation's dailies and weeklies were matching Nelson's determination as they supported the drive like nothing they had ever done before. The Wall Street Journal marveled, as the opening day approached, that more than 1,600 newspapers will lead the intensive drive to find junk metal to feed the hungry steel mills turning out weapons against the Axis. Nebraska's southern neighbor Kansas was particularly motivated. 10 days before the start of the drive, newspapers in the Sunflower State laid down an official challenge to its northern neighbor, confident that Kansas scrappers would surpass any Nebraska effort. Oscar Stauffer, head of the Stauffer newspaper chain, made the challenge clear.
We've never sat by in Kansas and let Nebraska beat us in anything. We won't let Nebraska beat us in scrap collection either.
In response, proud Nebraskans simply pointed to the University of Kansas football team's annual lack of success against the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Undaunted by this fierce exchange, the two neighbors continued their preparation for the vital drive.
You'd think that the Nebraskans would have been all played out on this scrap collection by the time the national drive came along, because they'd already generated 135 million pounds of scrap. But they apparently dove right back into it, and there was a big competition with Kansas to see not only who was going to beat the other, but who might win the whole McGill.
These preparations took place amidst the high drama of the home front, in a time of grueling world war.
We must keep this ever-increasing flow of equipment moving in a steady stream to our men on the firing line.
By this point, celebrities had been brought into the fold and were helping communicate the importance of recycling scrap. And to see Rita Hayworth sitting there, she probably convinced more than one young gentleman to turn in his bumpers, I would suspect.
These scrap campaigns also played on civilians' feelings of guilt. They tried to encourage civilians to feel that if they didn't contribute sufficient scrap, that some mother's son might die.
Dramatic ads for the campaign began to appear in newspapers nationwide, and their message was hard-hitting.
One of the interesting things about the messages of propaganda sent during the war is how frequently they used the word you. You, John Doe. You, Mary Jo. Individually. Not your neighbors, not some vague American people, but you individually must do your part if we're going to win this war.
The drive's appeals hit the airwaves, too.
Do you want a speed victory? Do you want to stop the Axis onslaught? Then start collecting scrap metals immediately. Uncle Sam needs vital scrap metals urgently now. Scrap is ammunition, it's hand grenades, it's bayonets too. Gather up your junk and do your bit to serve the nation in this time of need.
Even Daffy Duck got into the spirit of the national drive.
We're in to win, so let's begin to do the job with junk. We're in to win, to turn in your chin and listen to it crunch to our nation's call.
By the final week of the national contest, steel industry officials had good news. Scrap inventories across the country had expanded by some 50%, and most furnaces were now operating at near full capacity, milestones almost certainly due to the scrap drive. Despite this remarkable progress, however, Americans redoubled their efforts in what the Christian Science Monitor called the last lap of the drive.
War production is the foundation of our war effort. And by the same token, what you do from day to day affects your country's success in this war. We are all in this together. You and I, your own boy, and the boy next door. Our job is not finished. Let's finish the job together.
94% of Americans, according to a Gallup poll at the time, knew that the drive was underway. I have a hard time imagining 94% of Americans today being aware of any government policy.
Paul Cabot of the War Production Board was delighted to hear about the drive's amazing publicity success.
A larger percentage of the people are aware and familiar with the scrap campaigns than any other campaign that has ever been conducted in our history. Even if I do say so, I think this represents a damn good job.
Donald Nelson weighed in with his verdict, too.
The job the newspapers have done is absolutely unprecedented in this country. It has been magnificent. The results have surpassed my fondest hopes.
Eventually, 3 states claimed the final lead in the contest. Washington State finished in 3rd place, Vermont was in 2nd place, and in the 1st place was the Sunflower State, Kansas. Altogether, the nation's scrappers had found and turned in over 5.3 million tons of precious metal for the war effort, an average of nearly 82 pounds for every man, woman, and child on the home front.
Even if the material collected by the scrap drives wasn't industrially valuable, even if that material couldn't be used in the steel mills, it was important, I think, to the nation because it gave Americans a sense of a common goal, that they could all work together. It also gave American civilians a sense of purpose and a sense of making a contribution to the war.
You have a tremendous sense of unity, the idea that we're all working together to achieve a common goal.
Proud newspaper staffs were excited about the national results and their role in the success. One Associated Press story was particularly poignant. Eager Americans, it said, gave a thrilling display of what a people could do when united for a single purpose. They worked by the millions to root out steel and iron junk. Nothing was too small for them, they turned in keys. Nor too big, they tore up old locomotives. The Saturday Evening Post was also enthusiastic, declaring that Main Street went out to show Pennsylvania Avenue how to win a war by taking the red tape out of the blueprints. Even President Roosevelt was delighted.
So having seen the quality of the work and of the workers on our production lines, and coupling these first-hand observations with the reports of actual performance of our weapons on the fighting fronts, I can say to you that we are getting ahead of our enemies in the battle of production. And we Americans and our allies are going to win. And don't let anyone tell you anything different.
But I think it's a success because it gave people across America, of all ages, and especially children again, the opportunity to participate, to do something, to physically involve themselves in this war effort. What did you do today? What did you do this month to defeat the Axis powers? Well, I can show you what I did. I can show you what my town did. We gathered X pounds of scrap metal, and we're going to throw that at the enemy.
If you get enough people who are participating in something that is nationwide, you really get kind of a national esprit de corps, this sense that, all of the oars are rowing in the same direction, all of the arrows are pointing in the same direction, and in the case of these scrap drives, all of those arrows pointing in the same direction were pointing right in the faces of the axis.
This drive that is in some respects a scrap blitz, conducted over a relatively short period of time, was a wonderful example of a spirited and enthusiastic response by the American people to the needs of the nation.
In the aftermath of the National Scrap Drive, officials revealed the bottom line figures from munitions factories across the nation. Foundries were now running at 100.2% of their rated capacity, the highest rate since Herbert Hoover had been in office. Back in the Midwest, Nebraskans had found themselves in the thick of the scrap once again. The Cornhusker State finished in 6th place in the National Drive, with 123.1 pounds per citizen. It was clear that the Nebraska Plan had had a profound impact on the state and ultimately on the country.
A state came together and came up with a brilliant plan to get everybody involved, and they turned their houses upside down. They're digging bridges up to that are no longer being used and sending that scrap off to production plants. The Nebraska Plan was also essential, I think, psychologically. This war is long and it's total. Everybody's participating, everybody's making sacrifices. So the psychological impact of the Nebraska Plan was fairly significant because people in backyards felt like they could help.
People can do things on a small level, donating a little bit of scrap, but if everybody does it, then it's a big deal.
They may have been too young or too old to be at the front or be in uniform, but this was a way of service. And I think it produced a tremendous sense of pride.
The World Herald's editorial page reflected on this astonishing result and its national significance. What is the lesson, it asked, of Nebraska's salvage campaign? Working men were asked to give their toil and sweat. Farmers were asked to take out time during the busy harvest season. Businessmen were asked to give up machinery. Housewives were asked to cooperate so their sons on the battle lines might benefit. And in the end, all stood together, pushing, shoving, hauling, cheering for America. The lesson of this great drive, the newspaper concluded, is that no patriotic task is too great for the people if they know what to do and when and where to do it. Some 65 years later, the World Herald's editorial page returned to the memories of the scrap drive. On October 14, 2007, the newspaper recalled that at an hour of preeminent need, Nebraska's spirit in the scrap drive of 1942 helped sustain our nation. That monumental accomplishment needs to be remembered. Just ask the contemporary Nebraskans who were there. They are our links to a special time. They remember, and they do remember.
There was no question that we thought we were making an impact on the war. We were doing everything humanly possible. It wasn't just the scrap drive. It was the buying of the war stamps. It was the planting of victory gardens. It was just everything conceivable was being done by every person. Every person had somebody that they knew or was a relative that was in the war, that was in the service, and it was the least we could do.
For some reason, there was kind of a feeling of pride that had developed within us because, and I know what the reason was, is because we knew we were doing the right thing and we knew we were helping the overall effort.
Yet, for many of the scrappers, their hard-won lessons of work and sacrifice seem to have been lost. Although the U.S. has been at war several times since the 1940s, the home front has never been the same. Where, they wonder, has the national esprit de corps gone? Where is the national will to make a difference as patriotic citizens?
A lot of people in Nebraska did not like FDR at all, but the cause was much larger than
the president, and that was what they got behind, no matter whether they were, Republican or Democrat, or what they thought of the president. Most Americans, most of the time, tampered down that partisanship and asked the question, what is in the national interest here, not in the party interest, not even in my own particular political interest.
People that did not like FDR in the Second World War, they got behind him, because it was a national effort. It just wasn't a Roosevelt effort.
I mean, it's degenerated into this mess that we've got with red and blue states now. And I can speculate what it would take to unite red and blue states in a common effort, but boy, I hope we don't have to face that kind of thing.
There is no way that you could mobilize public opinion or public sentiment in that manner today. Now, you probably could have September 13th, 2001, but that time has passed.
We're at war today too, and our boys are dying just like they were back then, but the unity is not there.
Some scrappers wonder if more recent generations lack the experience to truly face a national emergency.
They haven't had to do without sugar and only buy 2 pairs of shoes a year. They haven't had to do a lot of that sacrificing that we had to do. They haven't had that challenge.
Most scrappers seem to have one important point of agreement, that the World War II generation was challenged to sacrifice by the Nebraska Plan and by other home front initiatives. Since that war, subsequent generations have faced little need to sacrifice, and so few show any desire to do so.
We went into Vietnam in the 1960s, and Lyndon Johnson said we can still maintain a great society. We can have both guns and butter. We didn't have to give up anything as far as Vietnam is concerned, and we haven't been asked to give up anything as far as the wars in the Middle East are concerned. What sacrifices have I been asked to make?
There is no bleeding in our living rooms in our nation as a whole. We are involved in a voyeuristic war, not a participatory war.
The demands on each of us, if we don't have a son or daughter in the service, is absolutely minimal unless we seek it out.
I think that people today need a drive within themselves, but they need to be told what to do. They need the government to ask them for something. And if they're asked, they'll give.
I don't know that the civilian populace has really been asked to step up to the bar and do what is necessary to get us out of the messes that we happen to be in at the present time.
My personal investment is essentially minimal. I mean, I'm not being asked to do a thing.
People today are not asked to contribute to any sort, I think, national effort that requires any sacrifice on our part.
Current administrations need to ask Americans to sacrifice. They need to ask Americans to come together for something larger than themselves. There are all kinds of things that the present generation, my generation, is capable of accomplishing.
Doing something for the good of the country is good for individuals because we realize that we are part of a larger whole, that we are just an integral aspect of what's going on. But we haven't been asked to do anything like that.
Americans haven't been given a specific set of goals and some specific ideas as to what they can do in their own backyards.
Well, I think there are many lessons of the scrappers, but I guess the one I like most is the fact that they showed up. They showed up with their hearts and with their bodies, picking up that scrap, hauling it those long distances, gathering up those mountains and mountains of metal. They showed up, they participated actively, with purpose, with cause. I'd like to hope that in the 21st century we would do a good job of showing up, of participating, of being engaged citizens in our democracy.
Such is the message that the World War II scrappers have for us today. They saw a need, and they responded. Without their patriotic labor, Rosie the Riveter would have had little work to do. Fewer and fewer tanks and planes would have been built. American GIs would have begun to run out of weapons and ammunition. Indeed, the good war, World War II, might have been lost if not for the efforts of these heroic yet stoic patriots. And although few people remember their efforts these days, their name persists, for we call them scrappers.